name's Rebecca Bailey. I'm the Programme Director for Towards the National Collection. I'm very pleased to welcome you this afternoon to the first of a series of 3 webinars looking at our foundation projects. Now, many of you may have been to events run by the projects or run by us about their work. And today what we're focusing on, and through this whole series of webinars, is their findings and recommendations for the future. So I don't think they'll be spending much time today revisiting their methodology and their extensive partnerships. What they're going to be talking to us about in this and the future webinars is very much forward-looking. You'll be aware that Towards the National Collection also now has 5 large discovery projects well underway, lots of commissioned research coming to fruition, and all of these pieces of work are contributing to our evidence base when we think about the future. With me today, I've got Javier Pereda, our senior researcher. He's technical lead today, I think. And we have backup and digital bouncer, self-described. We have David Selway from AHRC. They're looking after me today and looking after all of you. You've probably already received an email to say we had to make a very last minute change to the programme. Apologies for that. Rachael Kotarski, who was going to be talking about persistent identifiers, got struck down by the virus pretty much this morning. I have just heard from her sick bed, and she sends her apologies, but she really couldn't do this today. So we'll be looking to reschedule the PIDS presentation for one of the later sessions. So today we're very pleased to be highlighting 2 of our foundation projects. So these are Heritage Connector and Provisional Semantics. We're going to hear from the speakers in that order. Given the very different subject matter of the 2 projects today, we're going to take separate Q&As after each presentation. Sorry, I'm just looking at an instruction. That's not me that's muted, is it? No, I'm assuming you'd have told me by now. No, okay. So we're going to hear first of all from John Stack from the Science Museum, talking about Heritage Connector. And then in the second presentation, we've got Emily Pringle and Ananda Rutherford going to talk about provisional semantics. And just in case you wanted to focus more on one than the other, we're expecting provisional semantics to start at 20 to 3 now. So apologies to, well, if you're coming later to see them, you won't be here now, but I'm sending you my apologies for the change anyway. You can register questions throughout the presentations in the chat. You can either put your question there or just indicate you want to ask one, or you can put a hand up in the Q&A. If you write it out in the chat, then we'll probably read it out for you. If you put a hand up, we'll call upon you to turn on your camera and mic. And let you ask the question yourself. And we do like to see real people. So if a few people would do that, that would make us very happy. I think that's all my housekeeping. So I'm going to hand over to John Stack to share his screen and give his findings.
Great, thank you. So share screen. Hopefully you can see that. So I'm just, all right. Okay, thanks very much. So I'll give an overview of the project. I'll talk a little bit about our findings. Obviously, they're covered in much more detail in the final report. And then at the end, I'll pick out some sort of areas for consideration for future projects of this kind. So by way of background, our collection, like a lot of others, is primarily driven by keyword search, and it's drawing data from our collection management system. And primarily you're putting keywords into a search box. You're then getting a set of results, and you can kind of drill down into individual object records, and all of this data is coming from our collection management system or our digital asset management system. And all of that data is like a lot of other people's, kind of predates putting collections online. So, it's data that we've lived with for a long time, and there's been some augmentation of additional data fields for presentation, but the presentation has been kind of at the individual website level. So thinking about the challenge that the project addresses, so an end user has to know that an individual collection exists, needing to know that it might include relevant content to the thing that they're interested in. They have to know that content is available online. Obviously, not everything is. Then, as I've said, navigating by keyword search, and then they're going to kind of graph the relevance of the content that they're presented to their search results. And finally, from there, they can navigate to related content. So that's fundamentally the status quo that we're addressing in our project. So what are the limitations here that we wanted to approach and explore? So first of all, it's actually quite hard to get an overview of a whole collection's content. Generally speaking, descriptions of content tend to be presented as a kind of about this collection web page somewhere on a website, and some collections are quite homogeneous. They're monographic collections of a particular person, and some of them are extremely heterogeneous, like ours. They contain all kinds of things from aircraft through to scientific instruments, through to artworks and ethnography and so on. So being able to understand what a whole collection contains at a kind of meta level is not something that is currently done well by collection data or collection website interfaces. Their records, generally speaking, have very few links to related content, either within their own collections or indeed beyond collections. So that a lot of the collections themselves, and this is obviously part of what Tank is looking at, collections themselves are represented as silos, but actually within the collections themselves, there are lots of silos and lots of dead ends. We know from audience research, and this is borne out by work that Tank's done into users of digitized cultural heritage collections, is that sort of themes and topics are of great interest to users, but these are generally not well handled in collections data, and retrospectively adding themes and topics is would be extremely time consuming. But we know that additional data can enrich those records, and you do see a little bit of that. So we have some links out to persistent identifiers and to Wikipedia pages and so on, but it's very, very kind of sparse. And then linked open data sets can create new forms of research and discovery, but they tend to be quite labor intensive to put together, which is why a lot of linked open data projects tend to focus on particular slices through the collections or looking at particular areas rather than being something that's applied to whole collections. And so in our project, we're taking a sort of slightly different approach, which is rather than to kind of build something that's perfect as a linked open data set of our collection and others, we're looking at can you build something that's kind of good enough, that generates an enormous number of links, but where the quality of those links may be somewhat variable, but you've certainly got a lot more to work with than you did before. And then finally, human resources are limited, especially expert ones. And this is one of the things we'll come back to at the end about where to deploy limited human resources, because actually when you look at the workflows of the kinds of projects that I'm describing here, you actually need expert users all the way through. So our primary research question is, how can existing tools and methods be used at scale between poorly and inconsistently catalogued collections and other data sources? So we're working with 5 content sources: our collection, the V&As, the Science Museum Journal as an example of scholarly writing, and the Science Museum blog as a kind of example of more informal writing. And lots of the journal articles and lots of the blogs, in common with other content published by museums or scholarly journals and so on, references things in the collection, and yet they're generally speaking not well linked together. And then the 5th area that we worked with was Wikidata. So just as an overview of what Wikidata is, It's the linked open data set that sits underneath Wikipedia. So this is a Wikipedia page, and you can see that the body text on the left-hand side is created by authors. The images and media comes from Wikimedia Commons, and then on the right-hand side, you'll see this panel, and sometimes you'll see one at the bottom of the page too. So this is a linked data set. The data appears in the multi-language versions of Wikipedia, so these are, in a sense, statements of fact, which then flow through to the different language versions of Wikipedia. But it has its own website, which is human readable, but key to us is it's also machine readable. And furthermore, it cuts across a very wide range of subject domains, so much broader than our collection. It starts to go into a kind of all kinds of other subjects, not just those related to museum collections. So these are the things that we've got to work with as an example from our collection, so we can address all of these data fields, and then we can start to build links across into Wikidata. And so here's the train station on the right hand side, and you can see it contains dates and latitude and longitude and so on. So if we can build links between these things, we can then start to access this other data on the right hand side, and I'll show you a couple of examples later on where we've worked on those kinds of things. So fundamentally 3 technologies: machine learning, specifically natural language processing, linked data, and knowledge graphs. So just what is linked data and what is knowledge graphs? So on the left hand side, this is traditionally how museums structure content in their collection management system. So essentially everything is in a predefined box of some kind. So and this works well for presenting collections online as we currently do, but it's not very extendable. And so if you want to add new data points and new fields, you have to be quite careful about how you do that. How will they be used? How are they used in the future? On the right hand side is a linked data knowledge graph model, which uses these kind of statements, and they're usually in 3 parts: a thing, a relationship, and then another thing. And the things can be anything, and the relationships can be anything, and the other thing it's related to can also be more or less anything. So you can kind of extend out knowledge by taking the structured data on the left-hand side and starting to express it through a knowledge graph, as you see on the right. And critically, the linked data is also machine readable. So you can start to apply mathematical analyses across these data sets, and you can start to build new kinds of interfaces. This is our how we built the knowledge graph. So there's multiple components to the approach we took. So it's not really a monolithic thing. There's lots of steps to the process. There's a very, very detailed technical blog post and a technical paper outlining exactly what we did here. So you may not be glad to know that I'm not going to go into lots of technical detail here and now. But fundamentally, we're loading content in from the left-hand side. We're building links to Wikidata, and then we're using natural language processing in the bottom right-hand corner to also process some of the content as it's loaded in. So what can we do with that? We can start to link our collections on the left to Wikidata records on the right. And once we've done that, we then have access to a whole bunch of further data there. We can know other things that are also linked to that point within our knowledge graph. And we can also process using natural language processing, 2 techniques, named entity recognition and entity linking, to go through blocks of text. We'll come back to this a bit later on, because one of the big learnings of the project was these blocks of text, be they descriptions in collection fields or be they blog articles or journal articles, are really rich sources for this kind of work and this kind of link building. So our key findings. So the methods generated enormous numbers of links, and I'll pull up some stats in a minute of how big. So one of the key things is that we realized that we needed to be quite selective about the kind of content that we were pulling in, because running these various processes started to turn out links in the hundreds of thousands. But working with the knowledge graph that comes from this huge number of these linked data statements showed kind of fruitful avenues for improved research and discovery. And I'll show a couple of the examples of the kinds of things that we built, just really as demonstrators. They're not really production ready user interfaces, but they start to point in interesting directions. As I said, the text fields and the article content were really valuable locations for link building, which came as a surprise to us, because we thought that, going into the project, one of our assumptions was that the structured information, so titles, data that was held in particular fields in the data set, so titles, media, dates, and so on, would be the most fruitful area, because they were already kind of structured or semi-structured. But the description fields and the blog and article content tended to contain huge numbers of entities mentioned, which meant that as we started to plot out what objects were related with other ones in our collection, in the V&As and so on, those articles tended to be really powerful linking areas. We were able to demonstrate that, working with Wikidata, we were able to bring in lots of new data alongside our own collection catalog in a way that didn't require us to extract and then load in that data alongside our collection catalog. We were able to do it in kind of a loose way, but that because Wikidata kind of is within itself linked and references on to other subjects and other data points, the individual objects, which might only have one link to a Wikidata entity, suddenly became quite, really a rich place to start to explore new forms of research and discovery. Generally speaking, the false positives were usually really readily apparent. So one of the concerns going in, and one of the unknowns, was if the machine learning models make a mistake when they're trying to build a link between something and something else, would those results be obvious to a non-specialist user? And our findings were generally they tended to be really quite egregious. So it would be an 18th century person who would happen to share the name of a sort of 1950s baseball player. And so starting to think about how you would present this kind of content in a user interface to the public, that we felt like you definitely need to frame it, and we'll come back to that at the end. But actually, most of the links built were really high quality, and where there were mistakes, they were usually fairly obvious, and so we didn't feel like it's going to kind of take people down the wrong path. And new forms of interface can be developed on top of knowledge graphs, and they really are needed, because the data level connectivity to the knowledge graph is extremely difficult to work with and is quite unforgiving. It has a very particular syntax which you used to know when you're writing a query, and it's not something that you could give to an everyday user. So we started to explore in a couple of demonstrators, which I'll show later on, the kinds of interfaces which might be possible in the future. So just some high-level statistics. So we ingested about 350,000 pieces of content from the Science Museum, so from the collection, from the blog, and from the journal, and a similar number from the V&A. That's not the whole V&A's collection, which had been our original intent. We just picked off a kind of slice through their collection, which we felt like spoke well to our collection, and in part that's one of the learnings is, if you're not selective about what content you're loading in, you're going to very quickly generate an unmanageable amount of links to work through and to handle. And then we generated about things from our collection, about almost 9,000 things were directly linked to Wikidata. And then using the machine learning natural language processing, about 500,000 connections between records, so things within our own collections, about 650,000 things added to Wikidata, and about 1.2 million things to things that the computer thought were entities and therefore worthy of having a link, but were unknown, which is really interesting, because what we didn't have time to do was to work through these 1.2 million things and work out what kinds of categories did they fall into. But clearly it's generated links there, and we did use those links, and I'll come on and show you a little bit of that in a second. But they were things that kind of lived beyond our collection or Wikidata. And then in the end, we added about 100,000 pages in the knowledge graph linking to related to Wikidata or Wikipedia. So fundamentally, what we've done is we've started with our collection being a number of things, with very few links between them: object makers, object makers linked to objects, or companies, or people, and so on. We've managed to take some of those things and link them onto Wikidata, and then from Wikidata to other Wikidata entities, and then from there beyond into things that exist beyond Wikidata, so which could be other museums and so on. We built an enormous number of new links within our own collection and the V&A's collections, so things that weren't previously linked up have been done so, and then the system was able to kind of create kind of groupings and topics. So I'll talk a little bit about the kinds of interfaces which we explored and say a little bit about what we learned from them, what we thought was interesting. So we built a set of demonstrators. They're still live now. The link is at the end of the presentation. And we were looking at kind of 4 areas. One was kind of macro views of the whole collection. We were looking a little bit at serendipitous discovery. How do you build links, and show links between things that weren't previously having links between them? We were interested in kind of new entry points. So are there ways in which you can take kind of themes and topics and other things of interest which aren't really within our own collection database, but which could be points of interest from which you could work into the collections into other places? And then what kinds of interfaces could you build as an alternative to keyword search? So this is the first, well, this actually wasn't in terms of order. I'm showing it first here. So we built a kind of macro view of the whole collection. It's not really intended as a way of exploring our collection, but what it enabled us to do was look at the ways in which the system clustered content together. So the knowledge graph has a notion of an embedding. So you can, things within the huge list of interrelated links between the objects have a notion of kind of closeness between them, and it's measured in like multi-dimensional space, so dozens of dimensions, but here it's been flattened down into 2 dimensions. So things that are close together have a relationship between them, and some of those things are related to the way that the collection is catalogued. So you can sort of switch between the visualizing the kinds of things in our collection by the way that we've categorized them, and then look, you can kind of color code the clusters, and you can color code the types of object. So as you move in, none of these, you'll see that some of the things that are collection categories actually have grouped together. But in other areas, as you start to move around, you see that kind of clusters have naturally emerged between the 2 collections and the blog posts and journal articles, which didn't exist before. So they're entirely created by the processing of the knowledge graph. So the second thing to show is we created a bookmarklet, and this is really, we used some code from the Heritage PIDs project, so hats off to them. And what that does is, as you go through our collection, this is rather than building widgets on our own collection page, we essentially added this layer that you could pull out across the top, which shows from an individual thing in our collection, the links that the knowledge graph has built on the right-hand side. And if you start to play with this, one of the things that you see is that we have a related content field at the bottom of our collection pages, but the related content generated here was so much better and threw up so many more interesting things and interesting onward journeys that it's proved to be, you know, really something to think about in terms of how collections might start to, from an individual object page, because that's where most people land when they search and come to a collection. How do you move from an object onto related content, be that a journal or be that another object? And once you start, one of the things that is quite good about this approach is clearly this is going to scale, because it doesn't require a human to go in and sort of hand pick the things that should appear as kind of suggested onward journeys from particular pieces of content.
You're running out of time, John.
Okay, yep, handful more slides. So we've got a Metadata Explorer. So this is a way of exploring the whole knowledge graph as in a visual way. And what you can see is you can jump in on particular topics here on the Olympics, and then you can find content related to that topic from the Science Museum group, from the V&A, and from our blogs and journals. So you can kind of move backwards and forwards across both collections in a seamless way. None of these objects in our collection or the V&A are tagged with 2020 Summer Olympics, but the system has pulled out that joining point. We built a map interface. None of the things in our collection have a geo coordinates within them. So this is entirely built by taking the latitude and longitudes from Wikidata and then plotting those on the map. And it includes all kinds of things: shipwrecks, sites of battles, laboratories, and so on. So here's a laboratory in the States, and it has a related object in our collection and in the V&A's collection. Very nice. And then using a similar sort of approach, looking at events as another joining point. So this is a timeline interface using a kind of similar technique where you can plug objects in both of our collections related to particular points in time. Okay, so things to consider by way of conclusion. So as I said earlier, the source data selection is really important, and which is why as we got further and further into the project, we were sort of leaning more and more on curatorial expertise to guide us to what kinds of data should we import into the process, because the data size grows very rapidly, which might feel like a good thing. A huge data set feels better than a small data set, but actually it becomes prohibitively difficult to work with, store, and manage. So thinking about data selection based on specific outcomes that are looked for is clearly a really key component to projects like this that we weren't expecting at the start of the project. Framing the machine learning outputs for users is really key. And one of the things that recommendations is more thought needs to be given to, as machine learning and natural language processing and artificial intelligence and so on are used to working with collections more in future. Research and thought needs to be given to how do you present this to end users. Very specialist technical skills are needed. This was really well beyond the skills of our in-house team, so we had to bring in expertise, and we've got extremely lucky bringing in an external software engineer. But these are very, very technical skills, and I think it really stretched a lot of the people in the museum side to really deeply understand what was happening. So in addition to technical skills, I guess the other thing is you really need a technologist who can communicate with humanities people around collections to kind of get the best out of these things. And then it really challenges the cultural heritage notions of what canonical collection data is. You're doing things here that in a sense are almost at odds with how we build and manage and present our collection information. But what you can see is there's lots of benefits to creating new kinds of interfaces and adding these layers of data. And then human expert input is needed throughout. At practically every stage of our project, we were drawing in time from curators and people in our research department to really kind of work with us on how we should approach each stage of the project. That's it. Thanks you very much. There's lots of information on our blog posts from the project. We blogged extensively. And here's the project partners in the bottom left-hand corner. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. John went a little over time, but we still have time for questions now. And if we run out of time for John's questions, we will do them right at the end after the next presentation. But that was fantastic, John. I learned something new every time you present that. So have we got anyone? I can't see any questions in the chat. Have we got any hands up? No? Okay, then I'm going to start with a question for John. I'm aware from being, involved on the periphery of your project quite how important your brilliant software engineer was. How do we make sure going forward that as a sector we can be attracted to the best talent in software engineering? And well, can we? And how should we attempt to be?
Yes, excellent question, because I think it's going to be a challenge. Okay, these skills are in very high demand in the marketplace, obviously. So what have museums got to entice people in to come and work with us? Okay, so the content is really interesting. There is strong alignment with potentially around sort of mission, and so what I think software engineers of this kind are looking for is a really interesting challenge. So in a sense, what we need to do is frame the challenge we have as in a really clear way. So there can be a tendency, I think it's a mistake, I'll go bolder. Okay, I think it's a mistake just to list out, here's a laundry list of all the technologies we want you to have, and then expect people to look at that and think, oh, well, I can tick off everything on those lists, therefore I'm the right person for the job. I think what we have to go at is, in a way, those things are almost secondary. In fact, I think we need to put greater weight on, this is the challenge that we're trying to address. Here's where we are as a sector and as organizations and what we're trying to do, and let them bring the technology solutions. And in the sense, that's what we did with Heritage Collector, which is we had a kind of sketch of the kinds of knowledge, the kinds of technologies we wanted to use, but we didn't lay it in stone. And so in part, I think, well, we got very lucky, but I think in part we were quite clear about what we were trying to achieve, and that this was a research project.
Oh, thank you, John. Let me just see. Richard, do you want to comment a bit further on this career path of research software engineers?
There was someone asking if you can expand a bit more on the need for new interfaces especially for knowledge graphs. So yeah, so what kind of perhaps the question is towards what kind of interaction HCI approaches can we use to expand or break the GUI perspective of how do we engage with that complexity of data?
You need to unmute now, John.
Sorry, being muted is so 2020. I think what's interesting is that probably what's happened is it's almost like all museum collections now almost all look really similar to each other, and in part that's because working with similar data sets, and because a number of sort of design patterns and best practice has emerged. But it's become, I wonder whether there's an opportunity to like flip out in a different direction. And I think what would be really interesting to explore is, do different user needs actually point towards a number of different interfaces that a collection might have, as it were, you know, a scholarly interface, maybe we would call it that, but it might also have a kind of playful interface, because museum collections have to like do everything from, you know, a 13-year-old who's doing their homework all the way through to, you know, a postdoctoral student and everybody in between. And so one of the things I think is really interesting is with a richer data set of the kind that we've been able to develop here, could you create, could the presentation layer in a web or an app or whatever, kiosk in a museum, could you start to like have different kinds of interfaces that really lent heavily in towards specific user needs? And I think it probably is viable that you could start to like move in that direction. So what I think sort of interesting about the knowledge graph, and in particular working with Wikidata, is it starts to spread out into to bring in data sets which would allow you to do different kinds of other interfaces. One of the things we talked a lot about in the project was, for example, the Spotify recommendation engine, and how you start to interact with Spotify, and over time, you know, based on what you listen to, it's starting to like say, well, why don't you listen to this week, and starts to draw content towards you. And fundamentally, Spotify is just a knowledge graph, as is Pinterest and Google and all these other things. So having something, personalization feels a little bit closer, and creating things that might be very, very playful, you know, especially for things like art and design collections, where, you know, inspiration seeking motivations can be like, you know, a quarter or even a third of the user base. You can imagine that you could create interfaces that really sort of like address that in a very specific way. So for me, well, just to repeat what I said earlier on, because I think it's the key point. I think for me, the thing is, you could add layers of presentation that wasn't a kind of one ring to rule them all web interface. It was something that users could kind of switch between, or turn on and off, or dial up and down. So that's really, really interesting. And it's almost, there's been a whole kind of area of thinking around generous interfaces, which I've been really, really interested in. And then I was at there was a tank convening at which somebody said, I hate the idea of generous interfaces. That person feels like a really key person to understand, to talk to and understand why. What's the issue there? Because it feels like they could be really positive in some instances and really hinder people in other instances. I think if you talk to a lot of researchers, what people want is a really powerful advanced search. But what that requires is really precise data. You know, they almost want it to be like a library catalog. And our data just isn't good enough for that.
You've given me a good in there, John, to plug a piece of research that we've commissioned that's just being finished at the moment, and that's a big audience consultation by the audience agency, and that does go into this area about how different audiences might prefer different kind of interfaces. We'll be publishing that shortly, and we have a webinar highlighting it on the 24th of May, and that's a double act with the digital audit we've also commissioned. Javier, I'm losing my voice. Could you wrap this up and introduce the next speakers?
Yes. So next we have Emily Pringle and Amanda Rutherford. So they're going to be talking about the oh, I just blanked it. Sorry. So about the
provisional semantics.
Yeah, provisional semantics. I'm thinking of Amanda, the colonial legacies. So yeah, so provisional semantics deeply linked to colonial legacies. So yeah, so whenever you're ready, please.
Sorry, I'm just going to share my screen.
for the slides. That working?
Fantastic.
Okay.
Okay.
Until I'm in. Yeah.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Pringle. I'm the head of research at Tate, and I was the PI on the Provisional Semantics project, and Ananda, my colleague here, was the research associate. I'd like to stress very much that the whole Provisional Semantics project was an incredibly collegiate group effort. So I'd like to make particular mention to Anjalie Dalal-Clayton, who is the co-investigator based at the University of the Arts London, who was going to co-present with us, but unfortunately was unable to. And also the other two co-Is, Helen Mavin at the Imperial War Museums and Tate Greenhug, who's at the National Trust. So we're going to talk very swiftly about provisional semantics, addressing the challenges of presenting multiple perspectives within an evolving digitized national collection. No wonder we just call it provisional semantics. If you move on to the next slide, Ananda. So I'm going to talk very quickly about the sort of aims, objectives, background. Ananda's then going to talk through the case studies, and then between us, we're going to give some sense of the findings and our recommendations. I think Ananda and I were talking earlier, and we said that I think for those folks who've been working in the field for a long time, none of our findings or recommendations will come across as particularly groundbreaking. But I think that they're nonetheless important to be made public, and that they are based on really rigorous research that took place in 3 institutions through a period of profound and extraordinary goings on, what with COVID and the like. So just to flag quickly what the aims of the project were, it was conceived to address what we see, and others obviously do, as a fundamental challenge facing the TANK program, which is how to develop ethical, equitable and transparent readings of objects in a digitized national collection. I think that kind of speaks for itself. We were really looking at how do we do this work from a kind of ethical perspective. And then if we move on to the objectives, it's really, for us, it was trying to get a sense of the scale of the challenge in terms of what needs to happen within cultural and heritage institutions, what are the processes and practices that need to be put in place, what are the resources that are needed, and kind of more even fundamentally than that, what are the kind of values that need to be underpinning this work. So that was our first objective. And the second objective was to pilot methodologies through the 3 case studies that engaged with, and the tricky word, the decolonization agenda. And one of the issues that came up throughout the project was, what do we actually mean by decolonization? And we need to acknowledge that that in itself is a contested term. But if we are going to try and grapple with the sense of how do we unpick the histories and narratives around our collection items, how do we support staff to work with colleagues internally and with key stakeholders to describe and interpret collections and catalogues? And then the final objective was to review with experts the efficacy of the 3 case study interventions. I would say that we tend, as the research panned out, we focused more heavily on the first 2 rather than the third, although we have done a certain amount of reviewing as we've gone along. And also, just to add that on top of our aims and objectives, we had 2 research questions, which I won't read out to you, but really our research questions were about thinking about the methodological, ethical and practical changes that cultural and heritage organizations need to make. So again, very much a focus on what do institutions need to do if they are to accommodate multiple and provisional interpretations. And then our second question was, what methods and approaches that engage intellectually and practically with the decolonial agenda can cultural and heritage organizations employ to produce search terms, catalogue entries and interpretations fit for purpose for an evolving digitised national collection. If we go to the next slide, Ananda. So our methodology was we had 3 case studies, which Ananda will speak more about, one at the Imperial War Museums, one at the National Trust and one at Tate. And running throughout the project, we adopted approaches that drew very heavily on practice-based and action research approaches. So the majority of the researchers were themselves practitioners working in the organization, the case study organizations. And so the experience of their experience of doing the research, of doing interventions and then reflecting on those interventions, identifying what was working, what wasn't, what were the barriers, what were the affordances of the way we were working, informed very much our findings from the research. Similarly, what colleagues that we were working with, both internal and external stakeholders, what their feedback was in terms of the experience of engaging with the research, that also was equally important in informing our research findings. And then finally, Ananda is engaged in a literature and practice review, which we're bringing to a close and will be published later this year. But we were, as Ananda was doing the review throughout the 2 years of the research, we were constantly referencing the literature and the findings from key literature obviously informed our thinking both during the project and also as we were drawing our findings and recommendations together. Just quickly to mention 2 important issues and mitigating factors, the most obvious one being that we were doing this research through COVID, as everybody else was. It both impacted the research directly in that some of our co-Is were furloughed, but it also had a profound impact on the institutions themselves and our ability to access the collections, our ability to bring external stakeholders in to have a look at the objects we were trying to look at. But we kind of found ways through those challenges. A perhaps more significant issue that did have a profound impact on the research and has certainly informed our findings was the makeup of the research team and the fact that we were a largely white research team. And the implications of that became increasingly significant. And we took a series of steps to mitigate the impact of being a largely white research team, not least focusing very much on our own personal positionality and undertaking readings and sort of reflection on how do we embed ethical anti-racist practices and what does it mean to be a largely white research team researching topics of this kind. And we will return to our findings from that later on. So maybe if we move on to the case studies, and Ananda, I'm going to mute and hand over to you.
Thanks, Emily. So I'm just going to talk through the 3 case studies, a bit about what they were about and some of our very headline findings. So the Imperial War Museum case study focused on a sample of it ended up being a slightly odd number of 53 photographs and their original captions from the Second World War official photograph series taken in India in 1942 and covering the recruitment of Indian soldiers during the Second World War. The purpose of this case study was to investigate whether the presence of contextual information and captions from perspectives outside of IWM can mitigate the harms of the colonial gaze very present in the images and language of the historic texts. The IWM case study provided findings in relation to institutional cataloguing processes and the value of close readings of collection objects. The study also offered insights as to whose perspectives need to be considered when undertaking any so-called decolonizing work in relation to collections. The process of recaptioning the images surfaced the degree of scrutiny, care and sensitivity required to undertake this work and the dangers of inadvertently or uncritically reproducing colonial and imperial perspectives. The IWM case study revealed that inaccuracies in how images are described may only be obvious to the people they describe or the nations they characterize. And also, the case study provided evidence of the valuable contribution that external researchers can make to institutionally led projects that are grappling with collections formed during empire and informed by imperial perspectives. I think that is missing a still. The next case study 2, was the museum display at Powys Castle with the National Trust. The National Trust case study centred on the so-called Clive Museum, or it is called the Clive Museum, collection of objects from Asia which are held at Powys Castle in North Wales. In this case study, we sought to rebalance the exclusion, erasure, ignorance and general neglect of historical narratives that do not match the agenda of British colonial control. This all took place, obviously, amidst much of the debate and media controversy around the National Trust in 2020 and 2021. The National Trust case study provided valuable insights related to how institutional object histories determine the nature of collection interpretation. So it's very much about situating when and how things were written. The research also surfaced the necessity of working with subject specialists, not least when in-house expertise relating to objects is absent. The case studies demonstrated the value of close reading again as a method for building knowledge around object collections, revealing too the wide range of perspectives held within institutions, even within institutions, on how histories and objects should be presented. So there were 2 sort of overlapping areas that came out of the workshops we ran with staff, colleagues, internal and external at the National Trust. And the first concerns the lack of provenance and in-depth subject specialist object-centered information and the steps needed to address this. And secondly, the case study workshops revealed that different stakeholders and audiences hold different perspectives on cultural material. Now that may seem very obvious, but there is a tendency when we deal with different audiences to assume that a community audience has one perspective, and that really needs addressing. We also found that interpretation practices need to evolve to reflect and represent a variety of different readings, taking a more flexible and multivocal approach. And the third case study is the Panchayat Collection at the Tate Library, which focused on, the case study focused on the Panchayat Collection, which is held in Tate's library. And the primary focus was re-inclusion of key stakeholders to tell the story of the collection and re-center the artists that it represents. The Panchayat Collection contains documents, ephemera, manuscripts, images, publications, slides, photocopies and research material illustrating an important link between modern art and activism. It was founded in 1988 by Bhajan Hunjan, Shaheen Murali, Simrat Patti, Alan D'Souza and Shanti Thomas to promote the work of South Asian artists and artists with Black, Caribbean and African heritage in the United Kingdom and internationally. The findings from the case study on the Panchayat Collection relate to the ethical and practical issues of the research project structure and understanding the complexity of attempting to incorporate a genuinely multi-perspectival and open approach to institutional practice. The case study, the Tate case study confirmed the degree of reparative sensitivity required by institutions working with artists and other stakeholders represented by and associated with collections in their care, especially in cases where collections and individuals have been historically marginalised. The experience of this case study indicates that relationships between stakeholders and institutions are not well served by the project format. We found that trying to build trust within a time and scope restricted research project in an environment where institutional reparations for past harms were needed was difficult. We observed how co-production, testimony and formal archival practices carried out in institutional context are undoubtedly extractive. Further, while research is recognised as valuable, a valuable and validating process for the institution's academic status and contribution in the case of the Tate to the art historical record, the cost benefit to those who are repeatedly positioned outside or adjacent to the institution as both subject and object in the research process is frequently misunderstood. Again, the case study revealed the importance of recognising and honouring complexity in multi-perspectival representation. The case study surfaced how genuine co-production requires institutions to relinquish control and fully embrace equitable working practices. Additionally, we observed that even in research practices that are positioned as solutions to racial bias and exclusion, such as diverse representation in collections, it was almost impossible to do this work without employing processes of institutional capture, ownership, and control of shared knowledge. So this case study is an example of how institutions can overlook and neglect collections that relate specifically to minoritized and racialized artists and are not perceived as relating to wider canonized developments in art and history. And I'll hand back to Emily.
Thanks very much. So these are some broader findings and recommendations, particularly in relation to the first of the aims to pilot methodologies through the 3 case studies. I think our kind of fairly straightforward finding is that projects are not a sustainable way to bring about embedded change. That the projects can remain, or by definition, time and resource limited. They can occupy a marginal or peripheral place within the institution, and they can allow the institution to, in some senses, say it's affecting change without the core structures and systems and processes to be fundamentally tackled. I think our next really important finding is that research projects should be designed and delivered by a team that has appropriate subject specialist expertise and lived experience. So that speaks to the issue that I raised about us being a predominantly white research team. But associated with that, and irrespective of who is part of that research team, any research team or project team should really engage in constant critical engagement with and reflection on researcher positionality throughout a research project. Again, relating very much to the findings that Ananda has spoken about with the case studies, it's imperative to build in time and resources to develop networks and relationships of trust with the appropriate prospective researchers. And by researchers, I mean those key individuals who are associated with or have an expert knowledge of the collections that any research project is engaging with. And what we found is that project budgets, timescales, and existing institutional contractual requirements can very often impact negatively on ethical and equitable partnerships with collaborators. I mean, one thing we found was that we had to go through our Tate institutional standard contracts and rewrite several clauses relating to issues such as intellectual property rights, because they tend to favour the institution over the collaborators that we're trying to work with in an equitable basis. And then this is findings and recommendations related to the next aim, to identify the scale of the challenge. It sounds like a sort of the mountain we have to climb. And I think absolutely without question, what we came to conclude is that institutions need to commit resources, time and energy to cataloguing collections, but that cataloguing needs to be informed by the appropriate subject specialist knowledge and experience in an ongoing and embedded way. And then associated with this, attempts to make change in cataloguing practice, interpretation and object description are informed by and themselves inform the wider context of institutional infrastructure, academic disciplines, professional behaviours, and broader socio-political attitudes. Again, this might be one of those kind of, yeah, that's pretty obvious, but I think it's just worth us reiterating that this work is not neutral and does not happen in isolation. Everything to do with the institution impacts the ability or not to do this work. Back to you, Ananda.
So in relation to that last one, what can we do and the recommendations, I had a sort of key question that kept coming up and was made manifest throughout the projects. I think, what can we actually do, having observed this stuff? So it started quite early on when we were looking at the collections, thinking about what approaches can be employed to engage critically with museum documentation, catalogue and records to tackle structural bias and the hegemony of traditional Western colonial norms of knowledge production and practice. And I've come up with a sort of putative framework of 5 key points, which I'm going to just quickly expand on. The first area that, so I've identified 5 overlapping and contiguous areas of focus in order to frame the writing about things for interpretation and cataloguing in order to try and work better or differently. This was designed primarily for practitioners in the museum sector and came out of what we observed in the case studies, as I said, but I hope it's useful as a set of key questions for researchers accessing collections information to understand better the interpretation or supposedly information authoritative records that they're actually presented with, and how they come to be the way they are. So the first area is always language, and it's where this project started and many other projects across the last couple of years. It's the words we use and how we write. The project began here, but consideration of the language should address more than changing offensive or outdated words. As we address the material in the case studies, language also clearly included tone, intent, authority, accessibility, and recognition of the fact that language is rarely static and often provisional. Additionally, transparent decisions need to be made for those producing content about how harm and offence are dealt with when describing or interpreting source material. And we're seeing more of that on sites like the V&A with content warnings and various sort of explanations about what's going on with our records. But without denying the historical or even contemporary use of racist words. So as I said, content warnings and context are potentially a bit more useful than erasure, which is a bit of a turn towards in some quarters. Language also needs to be considered in terms of accessibility and retrievability. For example, simply recording the original traditional colloquial name of an artifact in the language of origin can help avoid or expose mistranslation or misinterpretation. We're particularly bad about that in the UK. And it works to counter the false equivalency in description work that centers Western or colonial understandings of another culture. The second area is a consideration of subject and content, what and who we choose to write about, what topics are privileged and promoted in terms of publication, expertise, and resources, and used as representative of the collection. Attempting to amplify collections, art and artifacts from racialized and minoritized groups through research and cataloguing should be prioritized within core collections management work and organizational research agendas. Each of our case studies considered material that had itself been marginalized and not addressed. And many of the collections had just languished in or been there or left in a sort of benign neglect. The third area is knowledge creation and production. Who is involved in description and interpretation work? And this is a bit about the positionality that Emily was talking about, but who is listened to and whose knowledge is valued and recorded? Reflection on ethical and equitable future access, use and ownership of knowledge around collections, art and artifacts should involve scrutiny of the uneven power dynamics between GLAM holding institutions and individuals and communities. The fourth area is critical examination of cataloguing practice and systems. These are not objective or neutral, and we need to interrogate the tools that we use, be they databases or card indexes, how we organise and structure data, what information we choose to privilege in analogue and digital systems, data structures, and online publications directly affects the cultural and historical record. Lastly, it's important that those generating interpretation, cataloguing, and descriptive text understand the context and history of the existing information we use. Before and during cataloguing and/or interpretation work, we should situate them within institutional histories and infrastructure, social and political agendas, hierarchies of value, worth, and deficit thinking, as well as our personal positions, and recognise that these shape the material we produce, and that their authority, accuracy, and relevance are also fluid, debatable, and provisional. I'm going to just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much to both of our speakers. That
Thank
was
you.
Incredibly thought-provoking, and the team are due to be delivering their report to me in the next couple of weeks, so I feel like I've had a good taster of what's coming, so thank you very much. We have an issue raised in the chat by Barbara Wood. Barbara, would you like to ask it in person?
Unmuting is available now.
If you want to, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, yeah, I'm unmuted now, thank you. Yeah, really enjoyed that. Thank you very much for that presentation. But I just was interested in picking up on a comment you made about, I think you were saying that the loss of specialist curators, or perhaps access to specialist knowledge, was a drawback and a hindrance in the work. I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that, because obviously that is a big issue for all of us in the sector in lots of ways.
Ananda, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I've been a generalist, and so it seems a bit, and I think many people in museums are, and especially with the cuts, the expectation that you're meant to cover incredible amounts of information and history all of time and all of the things, increasingly outside national museums, that there simply isn't specialist knowledge. I think that when we worked with experts, particularly some of the art historical experts on Persian and Persian art and architecture and poetry for the National Trust, the richness of knowledge was stunning. And I don't know how you preserve that in an institution which is as large as the National Trust with its collections, but I think we've got to get better at reaching out and respecting voices that are not, that if we can't Google it or find someone we know who knows it. I mean, it's partly to do with networks, this, and it's probably something we should point up a bit more, that extending your knowledge specialist networks is crucial to producing really good, interesting discussion, interpretation, and understanding different ways into the objects and art and artifacts that because we seem to be using the same old material with the same old ideas and still presenting that as authoritative, when actually there are a myriad different ways and a myriad different people who have opinions on it. So yes, I think there is a sector problem. I think there's a connecting in research problem, and I think that the collections, it's also impossible to know everything about everything, but perhaps in institutions we need to be more humble and ask the questions of people who might know, because it's much easier to network now. So yes, is the answer to that. It is a problem.
Thank you, Ananda. I've got a question for both of our speakers. You talked about reflecting on researcher positionality. I'm not asking you to disclose your entire personal feelings, but could both of you say something about how this might have changed your professional practice? Ananda, I'm thinking what you're taking forward into the Transforming Collections project, and Emily, how you view research and Tate. Has this project changed you?
I can start off and say, without question, I think this project has had a huge and profound impact on my understanding of how we do research. What are the questions we have to ask before we go anywhere near putting a research project together? Who we need to be working with? What constitutes expertise and relevant experience? How the institution needs to position itself. I think it's impacted on every aspect of research and research practice. As I understand it, it's also made me reflect on my past projects and activities, and I think that's where doing a bit of personal positioning work is without question a hugely valuable undertaking, just to consider where as individuals we come from, what our bias, a little bit of reflection on how we might be biased in different ways, what experiences have led us to occupy the position we do currently. I have found it an absolutely invaluable, albeit very challenging experience.
It's slightly different, I guess, for me. I'm mixed heritage, and it's the first time I've been able to vocally address the ideas that have been bubbling under my entire career, but there's been no space for. So that's been incredible. It's also quite painful to see how hardwired whiteness is in everything that we do when you live within white histories all the time. So it's a constant discovery of, oh my God, that's inflected by that, or that's made problematic, and that those things need unpicking. And with each of the institutions we were working with, you know, they're profoundly British national collections and full of people who know this, but that not seeing what the barriers are is why this hasn't changed. That's why when Emily says these aren't new observations, they are well observed, everything that we've come across again, but they're not changing and they're not being addressed. And that's where the actual structural issues were writ large for me, that you can't move forward beyond a certain point, that there's what I call a sort of persistent tokenism, which is also the mark of a project in using artists. You know, we went through an incredible couple of years of flagging the issues of recognizing structural racism and it being governmental debate, and to be in the middle of that, considering my own practice, my own upbringing, learning and everything, has been, you know, difficult. And I mean, I'm not going to overrate the painful on it, but problematic. And I think it's very important to see how complicit you are in systems that you don't even recognize. So I think that's been the major sort of point for me, that in repeating behaviors that are actually problematic and need to be critiqued, and that reflexivity in practice, I think is really key, not just barreling on for the sake of the research, but actually, why am I doing this? Am I the right person to be doing this? Whose voice needs to be heard? Should I be amplifying someone else and step back? Should I even be doing this without, you know, without due care and attention to who it impacts on? And those are all questions in the sector at the moment, but I think there is a value in the exercise of doing this, and the degree to which people change or not is dependent on their circumstances, but I think that applies to sex and gender and ability, you know, ableism as well. So it's who am I to be doing this? And that's not imposter syndrome, that's just a little bit of humility in the mix.
Thank you both for being so generous with your reflections. Javier?
Yeah, so well, actually there is a question on the chat, but I'm going to expand it a little bit. So the question is also worth unpicking who is considered to have the subject specialist expertise. So that was the question, and I would like to expand that question for all the speakers, as in, if we frame that within the, let's say, the common metrics of power, we're challenging the economy, the authority, which language comes in, gender and the patriarchy, and the epistemology, so the subjectivity of knowledge. But at the same time, we expand everything that has been mentioned in Heritage Connector, and we have now a combination of all these new technologies. So it's a technical know-how plus the cultural knowledge as well. So I think in a way the question will be, what are the technical limitations to actually bring in the colonial praxis within this approach? So a question, let's say specifically for John, is your data limited based on the end of the amount of information in Wikidata in order for us to have the entity recognitions? Do we need to also ask that the technical people, so let's say people in digital humanities, to fully understand the technologies and the impact on the culture as well? So I think the key that Ananda mentioned was this uncritical approach. So is there any dangers of imposing colonial approaches through the technology? And so I would like to open that question for the three speakers, and kind of the big question forward: how do we start with this?
Shall I go first? I think the answer is yes.
Yes, my answer too. Yes, do that.
Yeah, my answer too, can I just say yes.
John, do you want to expand? Sorry.
Okay, so like collection, in a sense, my project is very much thinking of collections as data, and it kind of starts there. So and data is inherently reductive, and it has a history, and the whole set of decisions have been made about it over time by different people for different reasons, in ways in its creation. There are standards, but they are, which the data says it adheres to, but they're quite loosey-goosey standards, and they often don't say, well, this is what place means, or this is what influence means, or whatever. So once you start looking at how, once you start taking that data and starting to like transform it, to augment it, you're always starting in that place with what you're starting with. And I think what we've just heard is there's some pretty problematic stuff about what that starting point is, you know. And so to take the V&A's example, which I think is really good, and it's the one we often look at, lots of people on this call who haven't looked at how the V&A's approached these things. So they're making a decision not to present certain, to contextualize content in a certain way in their web interface. Would you want to do the same thing for the way that machines take it and work with it? I think the answer is probably you'd want to do that, but I don't think there's a kind of best practice about how you do that. So I think it's really an interesting one to think about how these two projects' findings kind of work together. I'll stop now. But like, fundamentally, I think it really does need a lot of thinking about.
I think that to answer Javier's question, which I think is slightly different from Chucky's in the question, and I want to answer that one directly as well, because they've asked something quite specific about expertise, which I think they're getting at. But with the technical expert, I think undoubtedly, yes, unless we're more transparent, especially around machine learning, about what the hell's going on, then we mitigate. We need to educate and translate and say what's going on, how the data is now being produced. And I think that's crucial. It does need context, because it's created. These things, these loose and goosey standards, as well as the really tight standards, are made up. And until you start saying that they are created for these reasons, and you can have a wiki page explaining that, I think we need to link out to the apparent ease and automation in which we receive our Google results, which is habitually what we expect from collections. You know, give me more, give me all of the relevant stuff, without always being cognizant of how much manipulation there is. And I think the other thing is that has wider implications for use. It is what we are kind of trying to do in the Transforming project, which is to apply the ethical thinking and also amplification of marginalized voices to ask those questions about, if the digital cultural record, which is what Rupika Rissam writes about, it looks this way, why does it look this way? And I love John's project, but you are using still the data that exists. And what we are kind of increasingly arguing for is that we need to be using the data that doesn't exist, that doesn't get foregrounded, that doesn't get amplified. And that's where the gaps are. And until that, and different ontological approaches, you know, until that surfaced more technically, to say that actually there are different ways in, not just there is one way in and you can see different stuff, but there are different ways into seeing this. There are different perspectives. And I think that's what John in some ways is reaching towards with the different sorts of interfaces. But it's certainly something with Transforming that is really crucial. What are the ethics around the use of this data? Again, it's the same questions. Who's doing this? Why are they doing it? How have they come to that kind of point of doing these things? And are they the best judge of what's useful? But just to talk to the question in the chat, it is worth unpicking what subject specialist expertise means. And in a research forum, I think we presume we're all talking about academic research expertise or professional researchers, curators, language experts, historians. But there is lived experience. There is also subject specialist expertise outside both of those things, and amateur and, you know, religious and heritage sort of ways of knowing things, experiential things that are beyond this, that we don't get into when we classify another voice and interrogate only that, and that other voice needs to have one opinion, and hopefully one that fits with the setup we've already got. Thanks very much. So I totally take that point. It is absolutely worth unpicking who we hear, and I hope that came across in the project and the talk.
Thank you very much. That was excellent, bringing both projects together there at the end. We are running out of time. I don't think anyone's queuing to ask a question, so I will bring this to a close. Thank you so much